The merciless Texas wind howled across the plains, driving frozen rain sideways with such force it felt like needles against exposed skin. Morgan Reeves pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, but it did little to keep out the biting cold that had descended without warning as dusk approached. His horse Renegade limped beneath him, a deep gash on her foreleg worsening with each labored step. "Just a little further, girl," Morgan murmured, though he had no idea where further might lead them in this God-forsaken stretch of nowhere miles from the nearest settlement. The land around them had transformed into a hostile blur of gray sky and earth melding into one continuous assault of wind and water. Morgan's thoughts grew as dark as the gathering storm. He'd survived Gettysburg only to freeze to death in the Texas wilderness. There was a bitter irony there that might have made him laugh if his face wasn't numb with cold. As Renegade stumbled again, Morgan made a decision. He would have to put her down. He couldn't let the animal suffer, and on foot he at least had a fighting chance of finding shelter. His hand moved to his holster fingers, stiff and clumsy, as they closed around the grip of his Colt. That's when he saw her. At first Morgan thought she was a mirage, a trick of his exhausted mind. A slip of a girl standing perfectly still amidst the chaos of the storm, her dark hair whipping around a face that seemed impossibly calm. She wore only a thin dress, yet showed no sign of discomfort in the freezing rain. Morgan blinked hard, certain she would vanish. Instead, she moved toward him with purposeful steps, her bare feet seemingly impervious to the rocky ground. When she reached Renegade, she placed a gentle hand on the horse's muzzle. The animal, who normally shied from strangers, grew immediately still. The girl looked up at Morgan, her eyes a deep, fathomless brown. She gestured for him to dismount, then pointed urgently to the east, a direction that to Morgan's eye contained nothing but more empty wilderness and driving rain. "There's nothing that way," he said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. The girl's expression didn't change. She simply took Renegade's reins and began walking east, the injured horse following docilely, despite its wounded leg. Left with little choice, Morgan trudged after them, the wind at his back, now somehow less biting than before. They walked for what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes. Just as Morgan was about to insist they stop, the ground began to slope downward. They were approaching a depression in the earth he hadn't been able to see in the storm, a natural hollow sheltered by a limestone overhang, invisible until you were right upon it. Inside, the howl of the wind diminished to a distant wail. The girl guided Renegade to the deepest part of the shelter where the ground was dry and covered with soft sand. Then, to Morgan's astonishment, she knelt beside the horse's injured leg and began to examine it with the confidence of a seasoned veterinarian. Morgan slumped against the rock wall, exhaustion washing over him in waves. He watched through half-lidded eyes as the girl tore a strip from her already tattered dress and dipped it in a small pool of rainwater that had formed near the entrance. With gentle, methodical movements, she cleaned Renegade's wound, her hands never faltering, even when the horse nickered in pain. Then came the strangest part. The girl placed both palms directly over the gash and closed her eyes. A soft sound emerged from her throat. Not quite a hum, not quite a song, but something in between. A vibration more felt than heard. Morgan was certain he saw a faint glow emanating from beneath her fingers, but surely that was just his mind slipping toward delirium. "Who are you?" he managed to ask before the darkness at the edges of his vision closed in. The girl didn't answer. Of course she didn't. The last thing Morgan saw before consciousness left him was her face serene and focused, bathed in that impossible light. Morning broke clear and cold, the storm having spent its fury sometime in the night. Morgan awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Memory returned in fragments: the storm, the mysterious girl, Renegade's injury. Renegade Morgan scrambled to his feet, only to find his horse standing calmly at the entrance to their shelter, her weight distributed evenly on all four legs. There was no sign of injury, not even a scar where the deep gash had been. And there was no sign of the girl. Morgan circled the hollow, searching for any trace of his strange savior. All he found were small footprints leading away from the shelter, soon lost among the rocks and scrub brush. It was as if she had simply melted into the landscape. "Thank you," he said to the empty air, feeling foolish, but compelled to acknowledge the debt all the same. Renegade nickered softly, nudging his shoulder with her muzzle. "I know, girl. I don't understand it either." Morgan ran a hand along the horse's leg, where the wound had been. The skin was smooth and unblemished, the hair not even matted from blood. "But I aim to find out." 1 month later, the livestock market in Hopewell Junction bustled with its usual Friday commerce. Ranchers, traders, and townsfolk moved among the pens of cattle, and horses' voices raised in haggling that occasionally rose above the lowing of livestock and the general din of a frontier town going about its business. Morgan Reeves stood apart from the crowd, his tall frame and weathered face marking him as a man more comfortable in the solitude of open country than the press of humanity. At 37, the former Union Army surgeon carried himself with the straight-backed discipline of a soldier, though his eyes held the shadows of a man who had seen too much death. "Reeves didn't expect to see you in town today." Sheriff Abner Jenkins approached his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Thought you were holed up at Lone Star until spring roundup." Morgan nodded in greeting. "Need a new workhorse. Old Thunder finally gave out last week." "Sorry to hear it." Jenkins glanced at Renegade tethered nearby. "That mare of yours, Still Sound, heard you got caught in that blue norther last month." "She's fine," Morgan replied, his tone discouraging further questions on the subject. He'd told no one about the mysterious girl or the inexplicable healing. Such tales would only mark him as either a liar or a madman. "Well, Mason's brought in some good stock from up Kansas way. Might find what you're looking for there." Jenkins touched the brim of his hat and moved on, accustomed to Morgan's taciturn nature. Morgan made his way toward the horse pens, but paused when he noticed a crowd gathering near the far end of the market, the section where less reputable traders conducted their business. Something about the energy of the gathering raised the hair on the back of his neck. It wasn't the usual cluster of men evaluating livestock or goods. There was a different quality to it, a current of something boogly beneath the surface. Moving closer, Morgan caught fragments of conversation. "Says she's worth every penny, though can't speak a word. Found her wandering the Appalachians half wild. Strange things happen around her, but she'll work hard enough." The crowd parted slightly, and Morgan saw what, or rather who, had drawn their attention. A young woman stood on a makeshift platform, her wrists bound in front of her with rope. She wore a simple gray dress, patched and worn, but clean, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe braid that emphasized the delicate lines of her face. But it was her eyes that stopped Morgan cold. Deep brown and fathomless, they surveyed the crowd not with fear or pleading, but with a quiet dignity that seemed utterly at odds with her position. He knew those eyes. They had looked up at him in the midst of a howling storm calm and certain while the world raged around them. "Starting bid is $50, called the man standing beside her, a tall, sinewy individual with a pockmarked face and eyes like chips of flint. "Samuel Blackwood's my name, and I guarantee she's worth twice that. Strong back, skilled hands, knows her way around animals better than most men. Only drawback, is she's deaf and mute, can't hear a word you say, can't talk back. Some might consider that a blessing in a woman. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. She a slave, someone called out. Thought that business ended with the war. Indentured servant, Blackwood corrected smoothly. Signed the papers herself, fair and square. 7 years of service to pay for her passage from the mountains and her keep since. Name's Sarah Grace, according to the mountain folk who found her. Morgan's hand moved to his holster before he'd made a conscious decision. The crowd fell silent as he drew his Colt and leveled it at Blackwood. "Untie her," Morgan said, his voice low, but carrying in the sudden quiet. "Now, hold on," Blackwood began, his smile faltering. "This is a legal transaction. I said untie her." Morgan cocked the hammer with a deliberate click. "Sheriff," Blackwood called, looking around frantically, "this man's threatening me." But Jenkins was nowhere to be seen, likely handling some dispute on the other side of the market. "How much?" Morgan asked, his gun still trained on Blackwood. "What? How much for her contract? $100. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, calculation replacing fear. $200. She's worth every penny." Morgan holstered his weapon and reached into his coat, extracting a leather pouch. He counted out the gold coins, nearly all he had brought to town, and held them out. 200. Now untie her. As Blackwood fumbled with the rope binding Sarah's wrists, Morgan found himself looking directly into her eyes. There was no surprise there, no gratitude, just a steady gaze that seemed to look straight through him to something beyond. Did she recognize him? It was impossible to tell. When her hands were free, Sarah rubbed her wrists briefly, then stepped down from the platform with quiet grace. She stood before Morgan, waiting. "Do you understand me?" he asked, suddenly aware that he had no idea how to communicate with her if she was truly deaf. To his surprise, she nodded once, her eyes never leaving his face. "We're leaving," he said, careful to enunciate clearly. "My ranch is a half-day's ride from here." Another nod, and she followed him through the now murmuring crowd. Morgan could feel the stares boring into his back, could almost hear the gossip that would spread through Hopewell Junction by nightfall. The reclusive rancher and his mute servant. There would be talk, none of it kind. As they reached Renegade, the mare whickered softly and stretched her neck toward Sarah. The young woman placed a gentle hand on the horse's muzzle, and for the first time a hint of expression crossed her face. The ghost of a smile there and gone so quickly, Morgan might have imagined it. "She remembers you," Morgan said quietly. Sarah looked at him, and this time there was something in her eyes, acknowledgement, perhaps. She knew exactly who he was. "You saved my life." Morgan continued, feeling strangely compelled to fill the silence between them. "And renegades. I've been looking for you ever since, though I didn't expect to find you like this." Sarah's expression remained impassive, but she touched her throat briefly, then shook her head. "You can't speak," Morgan interpreted. "But you can hear me." She hesitated, then made a rocking motion with her hand. "Sometimes." "Well, we've got a long ride ahead of us, plenty of time to figure things out." Morgan mounted Renegade, then extended his hand to help Sarah up behind him. Her hand was small, but surprisingly strong as it gripped his. As she settled behind him, careful to maintain a proper distance, Morgan felt an odd sense of rightness, as if a piece long missing from his life had finally clicked into place. It was a disturbing thought, and he pushed it away as he guided Renegade toward the edge of town. He'd done his duty repaying a debt, nothing more. But as they passed the sheriff's office, Jenkins stepped out, his expression troubled. "Reeves," he called. "A word." Morgan reined in, acutely aware of Sarah's presence behind him. "That? Who I think it is? Jenkins asked, eyeing Sarah with undisguised suspicion. I purchased her contract, Morgan replied evenly. Everything's legal. Didn't say it wasn't. Jenkins lowered his voice. But there's stories about that one. Blackwood's been showing her all over the territory. Folks say strange things happen around her. Animals acting peculiar, weather changing sudden-like. Sounds like superstitious nonsense to me, Sheriff. Maybe so. Jenkins's gaze lingered on Sarah. Just watch yourself, Reeves. Some say she's not right in the head. Others say worse. I appreciate your concern, Morgan said stiffly, but I can handle my own affairs. Without waiting for a response, he nudged Renegade forward, leaving the town and its judgments behind. But Jenkins's warning echoed in his mind as they rode, mingling uneasily with his own unanswered questions. Who was Sarah Grace? What had she done to Renegade's leg that night? And why couldn't she, or wouldn't she, speak? The Texas sun beat down on them as they traveled the vast landscape stretching endlessly in all directions. Morgan was acutely conscious of Sarah behind him, the light pressure of her hands on his waist, the occasional shift of her weight as she adjusted her position. They stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat the simple provisions Morgan had packed, jerky hardtack and water from his canteen. Sarah ate sparingly, her movements precise and efficient. She kept her eyes downcast, but Morgan sensed her awareness of every detail around them, the circling hawk overhead, the distant movement of a deer at the edge of a copse of trees, the subtle shift in the wind. We're about 3 hours from the ranch, Morgan said, as they prepared to continue their journey. It's not much, just a small house, a barn, some corrals. I run about 200 head of cattle, plus a few horses. Sarah nodded, her expression revealing nothing. I don't know what Blackwood told you, or what kind of work you're used to, but at Lone Star, everyone pulls their weight. I won't ask more of you than you're able to give, but I won't accept less either. Another nod, this one, with a hint of impatience, as if to say she understood the concept of work well enough. Morgan hesitated, then added, There's a small cabin about 50 yards from the main house. Used to belong to my foreman before he moved on last year. It's yours if you want it. Private-like. For the first time, genuine surprise flickered across Sarah's face. She studied him intently, as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning behind his words. It's nothing fancy, Morgan continued, suddenly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. But it's clean and dry. Got its own stove, a bed, a table. Better than sleeping in the barn anyway. Sarah's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She touched her heart briefly, then extended her hand toward him, a simple gesture that needed no interpretation. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Morgan said gruffly, turning away to mount Renegade. You haven't seen the place. Might change your mind once you do. As they rode, the landscape gradually transformed from the flat plains to gently rolling hills dotted with mesquite and oak. When they crested a final rise, the Lone Star Ranch spread out before them, a modest collection of buildings nestled in a natural bowl of land protected from the worst of the wind by the surrounding hills. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure built of local limestone with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Nearby stood a large barn, several corrals, and the smaller cabin Morgan had mentioned set slightly apart from the other buildings. A windmill turned lazily above the well, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the winter-browned grass. Home, Morgan said, simply, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and loneliness the sight always evoked in him. Such as it is. As they approached, a dog came bounding from the direction of the barn, a rangy blue heeler with one ear standing straight and the other flopped over. He barked enthusiastically, racing circles around Renegade. That's Scout, Morgan said. Best cattle dog in 3 counties, though you wouldn't know it to look at him. To his surprise, Sarah slid from the horse before he could offer assistance. She knelt in the dust, extending her hand to the excited dog. Scout approached cautiously, sniffing her fingers, then abruptly sat down directly in front of her. His head cocked to one side as if listening. Sarah placed her palm flat on the ground beside the dog. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, she looked up at Morgan and pointed to Scout's left hind leg, then made a gesture that suggested pain or discomfort. Morgan dismounted and examined the dog. Sure enough, there was a small burr embedded deep in the pad of Scout's paw, something Morgan had completely missed, despite working with the dog daily. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, carefully removing the burr with his pocket knife. "How did you know?" Sarah merely shrugged, but there was the faintest hint of that ghost smile again as she stroked Scout's head. The dog leaned into her touch with absolute trust, all wariness forgotten. "Come on," Morgan said, leading the way toward the cabin. "Let's get you settled before dark." And the cabin was dusty from disuse, but otherwise in good condition. It consisted of a single room with a small iron stove in one corner, a narrow bed against the far wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a collection of hooks and shelves for clothing and personal items. A small window let in the late afternoon light, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. "It needs airing out," Morgan acknowledged, pushing the window open. "And a good cleaning. But the roof doesn't leak, and the stove works fine. There's a pump out back for water." Sarah walked slowly around the space, trailing her fingers over the table, the edge of the bed, the cool iron of the stove. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Is it not acceptable?" Morgan asked suddenly, concerned that the simple accommodation might seem like an insult after the promises Blackwood had likely made. Sarah shook her head quickly, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the cabin and beyond the ranch, perhaps the entire situation. "Too much," Morgan guessed. She nodded, some of the tension leaving her frame. "Well, it's yours for as long as you're here," Morgan said firmly. "I'll bring you some linens for the bed, and there's firewood stacked behind the cabin. Do you need help getting a fire started?" Sarah gave him a look that could only be described as withering, and Morgan felt his cheeks warm. "Right. I'm sure you know how to build a fire." He backed toward the door. "I'll leave you to get settled then. Come up to the main house when you're ready, and we'll sort out supper." As he turned to go, Sarah made a sudden movement, catching his sleeve. When he looked back, she was watching him with an intensity that made something twist in his chest. She touched her throat, then her ear, then shook her head firmly. "You want me to know you're not really deaf?" Morgan translated slowly. She nodded, then made a series of quick gestures, touching her throat again, drawing a line across it, pointing to her lips, and shaking her head. "But you can't speak," Morgan continued. "Your throat was injured." Another nod, her eyes never leaving his face. "I understand," Morgan said quietly. "Your secrets are your own, Sarah Grace. I won't pry where I'm not welcome." Relief flickered across her features, and she released his sleeve, stepping back, with a small, formal bow of her head, acknowledgement and dismissal in one gesture. As Morgan walked back to the main house, his mind churned with questions he had promised not to ask. But one thing was clear: Sarah Grace was far more complex and possibly more dangerous than he had initially assumed. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to regret bringing her to Lone Star. Not when he remembered the gentle hands that had healed Renegade, or the quiet dignity with which she had endured Blackwood's crude auction. For better or worse, their paths had crossed twice now. Morgan wasn't a superstitious man, but even he had to acknowledge that such coincidence felt like something more than mere chance. The nightmares came as they always did, jerking Morgan from sleep with the taste of gunpowder in his mouth and the echoes of dying men in his ears. He sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs, sheets soaked with sweat, despite the chill of the February night. For a moment, he was back at Gettysburg, kneeling in mud, turned to slurry with blood, trying desperately to stem the flow from a young private's shattered chest. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. His face still smooth, eyes wide with the terrible understanding that he was dying far from home. "Doc," he had gasped, fingers clutching at Morgan's blood-stained apron. "Doc, tell my ma." But whatever message the boy had for his mother was lost. As a Confederate shell exploded nearby, the concussion knocking Morgan sideways into darkness. When he regained consciousness, the private was dead, along with 24 others from their unit. Morgan had failed them all. With a shuddering breath, he forced himself back to the present, the familiar contours of his bedroom at Lone Star, the pale rectangle of moonlight falling through the window, the distant howl of a coyote marking its territory. Sleep would not return tonight. It never did after the dreams. Morgan pulled on his clothes and made his way downstairs, intending to sit on the porch until dawn, as was his habit on such nights. But as he opened the front door, he froze in surprise. Sarah stood in the yard, barefoot despite the cold, her face tilted up to the star-strewn sky. She wore only a thin nightdress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In the moonlight, she looked ethereal, almost otherworldly. She wasn't alone. Scout sat beside her, alertly watching the darkness beyond the yard. And beyond him, to Morgan's astonishment, stood a young buck deer, its antlers a stark silhouette against the night sky. As Morgan watched, speechless, Sarah extended her hand toward the wild creature. The deer stepped forward with delicate precision and nuzzled her palm. The scene was so surreal that Morgan wondered briefly if he was still dreaming. But the cold air on his face and the solid weight of the doorframe beneath his hand assured him he was very much awake. He must have made some sound, for suddenly Scout's ears pricked up, and the dog turned toward the house. Sarah followed his gaze, seeing Morgan for the first time. The deer bolted immediately, bounding away into the darkness. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the moonlit yard. Then, with slow deliberation, Sarah approached the porch. Up close, Morgan could see that her eyes were red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "You should be inside," he said quietly. "It's too cold to be out here dressed like that." Sarah shrugged, slightly unconcerned with physical discomfort. She studied his face with unsettling intensity, then reached out and lightly touched his temple where a sheen of cold sweat still lingered. "Nightmare?" Morgan explained, though she hadn't asked. "Old memories that won't stay buried." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. She touched her own temple, then made a gesture like something exploding outward from her head. "You have them too," Morgan realized. "Nightmares." She nodded again, a shadow passing over her face. "Well, misery loves company, I suppose." Morgan stepped back, holding the door open. "Might as well come in. I was about to make coffee. No sense in both of us freezing out here." Sarah hesitated, glancing back at the cabin, then at the vast darkness beyond the yard where the deer had disappeared. "The deer will be back," Morgan said, surprised at his own certainty, "and the cabin will still be there in the morning. Right now you look like you could use something warm." After another moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded and followed him inside. The main house was sparsely furnished, but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating the living area. Morgan stirred the banked coals and added fresh wood until a cheerful blaze chased the chill from the room. He gestured for Sarah to sit in one of the two armchairs flanking the hearth while he moved to the kitchen to prepare coffee. As the water heated on the stove, Morgan found himself watching Sarah from the kitchen doorway. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames, her profile outlined in gold by the firelight. There was something almost painful about her stillness, as if she had learned early and well the art of taking up as little space as possible in the world. "How do you take your coffee?" he asked, then grimaced at his own thoughtlessness. "Sorry, I suppose you can't exactly tell me, can you?" To his surprise, Sarah turned and made a series of quick gestures pointing to an imaginary cup, then miming adding something and stirring. "Cream and sugar," Morgan guessed. She nodded, the ghost of a smile playing around her lips. "Well, I've got sugar, but no cream, I'm afraid. Milk will have to do." When he returned with two steaming mugs, Sarah accepted hers with a small nod of thanks. She took a cautious sip, then her eyes widened slightly in appreciation. "It's a special blend," Morgan explained. "I have it shipped in from New Orleans, one of my few luxuries." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional sigh of the wind around the eaves. Morgan found himself relaxing by degrees, the tension of the nightmare gradually seeping from his muscles. "I was an army surgeon," he said suddenly, not sure why he felt compelled to share this with her. "During the war. Saw things no man should have to see. Did things no man should have to do." Sarah's gaze was steady, neither encouraging nor discouraging his confidences. "I saved who I could. Lost more than I saved." Morgan stared into the depths of his coffee. "After Gettysburg, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't cut into another boy knowing he was likely to die anyway. So I walked away, came west, found this place." He looked up to find Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, not pity exactly, but something deeper, more complex. "I haven't practiced medicine since," he finished. "Not on humans, anyway. Sometimes on the livestock when necessary, but never on people." Sarah set her mug down carefully, then made a gesture he didn't understand, touching her heart, then extending her hand toward him. "I'm sorry," Morgan guessed. "You're sorry for what happened to me." She shook her head, frustrated, and repeated the gesture more emphatically. "I don't understand," Morgan admitted. Sarah stood abruptly and crossed to the small desk in the corner where Morgan occasionally wrote letters or kept his accounts. She found a pencil and paper and wrote quickly, her handwriting surprisingly elegant. When she handed him the note, Morgan read, "Not sorry for you. Sorry with you. I understand loss." "You can write," Morgan said, surprised. "I didn't realize." Sarah took the paper back and added, "Not well. Simple things only. Taught myself from books." "That's impressive." Morgan's estimation of her rose another notch. "Did Blackwood know you could write?" A shadow crossed Sarah's face, and she shook her head vehemently. She wrote again, "Dangerous to know too much. Men like him use knowledge as weapon." "I understand," Morgan said softly. "Your secret's safe with me." Sarah studied him for a long moment as if gauging his trustworthiness. Then she nodded once, a decisive gesture, and wrote, "You have medicine books." The question caught Morgan off guard. "Yes, in my study. Why, want to learn, help animals, maybe people someday." Morgan felt a strange tightness in his chest. "I'm not a teacher, Sarah. I'm barely a doctor anymore." She regarded him steadily, then wrote, "Everyone can teach something. Everyone can learn something. Even broken people like us." The word struck Morgan like a physical blow. Broken people like us. So matter-of-factly stated, as if the brokenness were simply a condition to be acknowledged, like the color of one's eyes, or the shape of one's hands. "I'll think about it," he said finally, "but for now it's late. We should both try to get some sleep." Sarah nodded and rose gracefully, gathering her empty mug and carrying it to the kitchen. When she returned, she paused at the door, looking back at Morgan with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been something else entirely. Then she was gone, a pale figure moving through the moonlight toward her cabin, Scout trotting faithfully at her heels. Morgan remained by the fire, turning her written words over in his mind. "Broken people like us." The simple phrase haunted him long after the fire had died to embers, and the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the sky. The days that followed established a rhythm of sorts. Sarah rose before dawn and tended to the animals with a skill that impressed even Morgan, who had worked with livestock all his life. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of their needs, knowing which cow was about to calve, which horse needed its hooves trimmed, which chicken had stopped laying due to illness rather than age. Morgan, true to his word, showed her his small library of medical texts. To his surprise, she devoured them with an intensity that was almost frightening, spending every spare moment poring over the dense volumes, mouthing the words silently, as she read, occasionally making notes in a small journal she kept tucked in her pocket. They developed a form of communication that was part gesture, part written word, and part something less definable, an understanding that sometimes seemed to require no expression at all. Morgan would think of a task that needed doing only to find Sarah already engaged in it. Sarah would prepare coffee just as Morgan was about to ask for it. Small things easily dismissed as coincidence, yet they accumulated until Morgan could no longer ignore the strange connection forming between them. By the end of the second week, it was as if Sarah had always been at Lone Star. The animals responded to her as they never had to Morgan or his previous hands. The cattle grew calmer in her presence. The horses followed her with their eyes as she moved about the ranch. Even the chickens seemed to lay more consistently. Wild creatures continued to appear at the edges of the property, deer, rabbits, once even a fox that sat calmly, while Sarah examined an injured paw. It was uncanny, but Morgan found himself growing accustomed to the strangeness. More than that, he found himself depending on her. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now. On the bad nights, he would sometimes find Sarah already on the porch when he emerged from the house, as if she had sensed his distress across the yard. They would sit together in companionable silence, or sometimes Morgan would talk about the war, about the men he had failed to save, about the way the cries of the dying still echoed in his ears years later. Sarah never offered platitudes or easy comfort. She simply listened, her presence somehow both anchor and balm. Morgan never asked about her own nightmares, respecting the privacy she so clearly valued. But sometimes he caught her watching the horizon with a haunted expression that spoke of terrors he could only imagine. On one such evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of fire, Morgan found himself speaking of things he had told no one. "I had a wife once," he said quietly. "Before the war, Caroline. She was everything. Kind, brilliant, beautiful. She wanted me to become a doctor, said I had a gift for healing. So I did. For her." Sarah turned to look at him, her expression attentive but neutral. "She died in childbirth. Our son, with her." Morgan's voice was flat, stripped of emotion by years of grief. "I couldn't save either of them. All my training, all my so-called gift, and I couldn't save the two people who mattered most." Sarah reached out tentatively and touched his hand, a fleeting contact that was gone almost before he registered it. "After that, I enlisted. Figured if I couldn't save my own family, maybe I could save someone else's son or brother or husband." A bitter laugh escaped him. "You know how that turned out." Sarah withdrew a small slate and chalk from her pocket tools Morgan had given her for when paper was impractical, and wrote quickly, "Not your fault. Either time." "Isn't it?" Morgan's voice held a harshness he hadn't intended. "I was their doctor, their protector. Their failure is my failure." Sarah erased the slate and wrote again, "Some things beyond control, even for doctors, even for good men." "You don't know what kind of man I am," Morgan said softly. Sarah's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I know enough." The simple statement hung between them as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. Morgan felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he had carried for so long he'd ceased to notice its weight. Before he could respond, the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Morgan stood instantly alert. Visitors were rare at Lone Star, especially after dark. 3 riders emerged from the gathering darkness, their forms gradually taking shape as they neared the house. Morgan recognized Sheriff Jenkins at the lead, flanked by 2 men he didn't know. "Evening, Reeves," Jenkins called as they reined in before the porch. "Hope we're not interrupting your supper." "Just finished," Morgan replied evenly, though they had not yet eaten. "What brings you out this way, Sheriff?" Jenkins dismounted, his expression grave. "Official business, I'm afraid." He glanced at Sarah, who had risen to stand slightly behind Morgan. "Might be better if we spoke privately." "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Miss Grace," Morgan said firmly. Jenkins sighed. "Have it your way." He gestured to one of his companions, a sallow-faced man with a perpetual squint. "This here is Mr. Garrett. He's come from Virginia with some questions about your employee." Garrett stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made Morgan's hackles rise. "Miss Grace," Garrett said, pronouncing the name as if it tasted bad. "Or should I say, Sarah Caldwell." Sarah went very still beside Morgan, her face suddenly bloodless in the fading light. "My name is Theodore Garrett, Miss Caldwell. I represent your father, Reverend Josiah Caldwell, of Pine Ridge, Virginia. He's been searching for you for quite some time." Morgan felt rather than saw the tremor that ran through Sarah's body. She made no response, her expression frozen in a mask of control that seemed to cost her dearly. The good Reverend was most distressed to learn his daughter had fallen into unfortunate circumstances, Garrett continued. "He has authorized me to bring you home by force if necessary." "And what makes you think this woman is the Reverend's daughter?" Morgan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Garrett produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I have here a description that matches Miss Grace in every particular, including the distinctive scar across her throat, the result of a tragic accident in her youth, I'm told." "If that's true, why did Blackwood claim she was an indentured servant?" Morgan demanded. "Why would her own father allow her to be sold like livestock?" "I cannot speak to Mr. Blackwood's actions," Garrett replied smoothly. "Only to the fact that Reverend Caldwell wishes his daughter returned to him immediately. As her legal guardian—" "She's a grown woman," Morgan interrupted, "not a child to be ordered about. Miss Caldwell is afflicted with various mental infirmities," Garrett said, his tone suggesting he was being delicate. "The courts have granted her father continued guardianship due to her inability to care for herself. She seems perfectly capable to me. With all due respect, Mr. Reeves, you've known her for what, 2 weeks?" Garrett's smile never reached his eyes. "The Reverend has raised her from birth. I think he knows better what his daughter needs." Throughout this exchange, Sarah had remained utterly still, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on some middle distance. Now, abruptly, she moved, stepping forward to stand directly before Garrett. With deliberate precision, she pulled down the collar of her dress just enough to reveal the scar on her throat, a jagged line that spoke of violence, not accident. Then she pointed directly at the paper in Garrett's hand and shook her head vehemently. "Seems Miss Grace disagrees with your story," Morgan observed, "and I'm inclined to believe her." "Her delusions are well documented," Garrett said dismissively. "She has frequently accused her father of harming her, when in fact the Reverend has sacrificed everything to care for his disturbed child." Sarah suddenly snatched the slate from her pocket and wrote rapidly, showing it first to Morgan, then turning it so the others could see. "He tried to kill me, cut my throat when I wouldn't stop speaking truth. You see," Garrett sighed heavily, "these fantasies have plagued her for years. The Reverend feared something like this might happen if she escaped his care." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "Reeves, I don't like interfering in a man's business, but if the girl's father has legal claim—" "I purchased her contract," Morgan cut in. "Legally, in front of witnesses. If her father has a dispute with that, he can take it up with Blackwood. The contract is invalid if she was not of sound mind to consent to it," Garrett countered, "which she clearly was not." Sarah wrote again, her chalk squeaking on the slate. "I am not insane. He is lying. Please don't let them take me." The naked fear in her eyes, as she showed Morgan the slate, struck him like a physical blow. In that moment, any doubts he might have harbored about her story vanished. "I think you gentlemen should leave," Morgan said, his hand dropping casually to rest on the grip of his Colt. "Now," Jenkins's eyes widened. "Now, Reeves, don't do anything foolish. We're just trying to sort this out legally." "There's nothing to sort out. Miss Grace stays here under my protection until I see some proof beyond the word of a man I've never met that she belongs elsewhere." "You're making a mistake," Garrett said coldly. "The Reverend is not without influence even in Texas. This will not end well for you." "I've faced worse threats than a preacher from Virginia," Morgan replied. "Good night, gentlemen." For a tense moment, it seemed Garrett might press the issue. But Jenkins, clearly wanting no part of a confrontation, touched the man's arm. "Come on, Mr. Garrett. We'll sort this out in town tomorrow with the proper paperwork." With obvious reluctance, Garrett remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Reeves. Not by a long shot." Morgan watched them ride away, his hand still on his gun, until they disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he turn to Sarah, who stood frozen on the porch, the slate clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles showed white. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. "Is Caldwell your father?" Sarah nodded once her eyes haunted. "And did he do that to your throat?" Another nod accompanied by a single tear that traced a silvery path down her cheek. "Well, he's not getting you back," Morgan said with quiet certainty. "Not while I'm breathing." Sarah looked up at him, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude, fear, and something deeper that Morgan couldn't quite name. She wrote on the slate, her hands shaking slightly, "You don't know what he's capable of. What I'm capable of." "I know enough," Morgan said, echoing her earlier words. "Now come inside. We need to talk." As they entered the house, the first raindrops of a spring storm began to fall, pattering softly on the roof, like a warning of things to come. The storm intensified through the night rain, lashing against the windows of the main house, where Morgan and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a lamp casting warm light over the scattered papers between them. Morgan had brought out every document related to his purchase of Sarah's contract, searching for any legal protection against Garrett's claims. "The problem is," Morgan said, running a hand through his hair in frustration, "if what Garrett says is true, if your father convinced a court you're not of sound mind, then the contract might not hold up." Sarah wrote on her slate, "I am not insane. Never was." "I know that," Morgan assured her. "But the law might see it differently, especially if your father has influence." Sarah's expression darkened. She wiped the slate clean and wrote, "He is a powerful man. Church money connections. People believe him because he speaks for God." "And you? What did you speak for that made him want to silence you?" Sarah hesitated, her chalk hovering above the slate. Finally, she wrote truth. About Mother, about what he did to her. "What did he do?" Sarah shook her head, a tremor running through her hand. She couldn't write it, not yet. "All right," Morgan said gently. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I need to know what we're dealing with if I'm going to help you." She wrote quickly, "He will say I am possessed, that I hear voices, see things, that I hurt myself and others. And is any of that true?" Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. She shook her head vehemently. "I had to ask," Morgan said. "Not because I believe it, but because I need to know what he'll use against us." The anger faded from Sarah's eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. She wrote, "I do hear and see differently. Animals speak to me, not words, feelings, pain, need, since I was small. Mother, too." Morgan nodded slowly. "That explains a lot. The deer scout's paw, renegade's leg. Mother called it a gift. Father called it witchcraft." A chill ran down Morgan's spine at the word witchcraft. Even in 1887, in supposedly enlightened times, such accusations could be dangerous, especially coming from a respected minister. "Is that why he tried to kill you, because he thought you were practicing witchcraft?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly, pain etching lines around her mouth. When she opened them again, there was a fierce determination in her gaze. She wrote for a long time, filling the slate, erasing, writing more. Mother was healer. Plants, hands, songs. People came from everywhere. Father allowed because brought money, respect. Then Mother tried to heal wrong person. Mayor's wife, cancer. Mother said too late, but tried. Woman died. Mayor blamed Mother, called her witch. Sarah paused, her hands trembling slightly. Morgan waited, sensing there was more, much more to the story. Father, afraid of scandal, turned against Mother, said she made deal with devil, led prayer meetings against her. I defended her, told truth he never believed her gift was evil until it threatened his position. She erased the slate and continued. They came at night, men from town with torches. Mother sent me to hide in cellar. I heard everything. Screams. Father's voice leading prayers as they burned our home. Mother inside. Morgan felt sick. Your own father. Let them murder your mother. Sarah nodded, tears streaming silently down her face now. I ran away after. Lived in forest. Father found me months later. Said I was sick with grief, imagining things. When I wouldn't stop telling truth, he took knife to my throat. Left me for dead. How did you survive? Animals. Deer led old woman to me. Mountain healer. She saved me, taught me more. Died 2 winters ago. Then Blackwood found me. The pieces were coming together now, the strange connection with animals, the fear of her father, the silent determination to survive despite everything. Morgan felt a surge of protective anger unlike anything he'd experienced since the war. Your father won't get near you, he promised. We'll fight this whatever it takes. Sarah studied him, then wrote, why risk everything for me? The question caught Morgan off guard. Why, indeed? He'd known this woman barely 2 weeks. She'd brought nothing but complication and potential danger into his carefully ordered life. And yet, you saved my life, he said simply. And renegades. I repay my debts. Sarah's gaze was skeptical. She wrote more than debt. Tell truth. Morgan looked away, uncomfortable with her piercing insight. I've stood by before while people suffered. During the war. With Caroline. I promised myself never again. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was as much as he was willing to acknowledge, even to himself. Whatever this strange connection between them was, whatever pull he felt toward her, he wasn't ready to examine it too closely. Sarah seemed to accept his answer, or at least she didn't press further. She wrote, "What do we do now?" "First thing tomorrow, I'll ride into town, speak with Jenkins. See what legal standing Garrett really has." Morgan gathered the papers, straightening them into a neat pile. "Until then, we should both get some sleep." Sarah nodded, but made no move to leave. Outside, thunder crashed and the rain intensified. She wrote, "May I stay here tonight, afraid to be alone." The request was so contrary to her usual fierce independence that Morgan understood immediately how truly frightened she was. "Of course. You can take my room. I'll sleep down here." Sarah shook her head. "Just need to be near. We'll sleep on couch." "All right," Morgan agreed. "I'll get you some blankets." As he turned to go upstairs, Sarah caught his arm. When he looked back, she was watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. She touched her heart, then reached out to touch his, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as her way of expressing deep gratitude. "You're welcome," he said softly. "Now, get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Dawn broke clear and washed clean the storm, having moved on during the night. Morgan rose early, having slept poorly on the floor beside the couch, where Sarah had eventually drifted into uneasy slumber. She was still sleeping when he checked on her, her face finally peaceful in repose. He left a note saying he'd gone to town and that she should stay close to the house. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he placed his spare revolver on the table beside the note. Sarah had never mentioned being able to use a firearm, but Morgan wasn't taking any chances. Not with men like Garrett around. The ride to Hopewell Junction was quicker than usual, the roads emptied by the previous night's storm. Morgan headed straight for the sheriff's office, determined to get answers before Garrett could further his claims. Jenkins was at his desk, looking tired and harried. He glanced up as Morgan entered, resignation crossing his features. "Figured you'd be by early," he said, setting aside the report he'd been writing. "Don't suppose you've reconsidered turning the girl over peacefully?" "Not a chance," Morgan replied, taking a seat without being invited. "I want to know what legal standing Garrett actually has. I've seen no papers, no proof that Sarah is who he claims she is." Jenkins sighed heavily. "He showed me some documents last night after we left your place. Commitment papers from an asylum in Virginia signed by a judge. A letter from the Reverend authorizing Garrett to retrieve his daughter. It all looks legitimate, Reeves. I want to see these papers myself. Garrett's got them. He's staying at the hotel." Jenkins leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't have a dog in this fight. Far as I'm concerned, what a man does on his own property is his business. But Garrett's talking about bringing formal charges, kidnapping, maybe even violating the Mann Act." Morgan frowned. "That's absurd. I purchased her contract legally, in full view of witnesses, and there's nothing improper about our arrangement." Jenkins held up his hands. "I'm just telling you what the man said. He's determined, Reeves, and he's got the ear of some influential people in town already. Who? Mayor Thompson, for one, and Reverend Miller over at First Baptist." Jenkins grimaced. "They had quite a prayer meeting last night, from what I hear. Lot of talk about rescuing a lost lamb from sinful captivity." Morgan's jaw tightened. Ezekiel Thompson was known for his religious fervor and his influence over town affairs. If he'd sided with Garrett, the situation was even more dangerous than Morgan had feared. "What about Dr. Wilson?" Morgan asked. Samuel Wilson was the town physician, a man of science rather than superstition, and one of the few people in Hopewell Junction that Morgan genuinely respected. "Hasn't taken a side yet, far as I know." Jenkins studied Morgan thoughtfully. "Might be worth talking to him. Wilson's got a level head." "I intend to." Morgan stood. "Where can I find Garrett now?" "Probably at the hotel, but—" Jenkins broke off as the door opened, admitting the very man they were discussing. Theodore Garrett looked even more unpleasant in the clear light of day, tall and gaunt with close-set eyes that never quite met one's gaze directly. He wore a black suit that hung loosely on his frame, giving him the appearance of an underfed crow. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his thin lips stretching into what might charitably be called a smile. "How convenient. I was just coming to see the sheriff about a warrant for your arrest." "On what grounds?" Morgan demanded. "Kidnapping. Unlawful detention of a mentally incompetent individual. Possible violation of moral statutes." Garrett's smile widened. "Take your pick." "I'd like to see these so-called commitment papers," Morgan said, keeping his voice level with effort. "And proof that Sarah Grace is actually Sarah Caldwell. In due time. First, I must insist you disclose Miss Caldwell's whereabouts, for her own safety." "She's safe where she is," Morgan replied. "And she's staying there until I see evidence. Real evidence that she legally belongs anywhere else." Garrett's facade of civility slipped slightly, a flash of something ugly crossing his features. "You're making a serious error in judgment, Mr. Reeves. The Reverend is not a man to be trifled with." "Neither am I." Morgan turned to Jenkins. "Sheriff, if Mr. Garrett wants to press charges, he's welcome to do so. But I'll expect to see all his documentation first examined by a lawyer of my choosing." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "That's reasonable, Mr. Garrett. The law works both ways." Garrett stared at Morgan for a long moment, calculation in his gaze. "Very well. I'll have the papers delivered to your office this afternoon, Sheriff. In the meantime, I trust you'll keep an eye on Mr. Reeves. Ensure he doesn't leave town with the girl." "I have no intention of running," Morgan said coldly. "But I will be returning to my ranch today. If you want to stop me, you'll need more than vague accusations and mysterious papers." Without waiting for a response, Morgan strode from the office, his mind already racing ahead due to his next move. He needed to speak with Dr. Wilson, then get back to Lone Star as quickly as possible. Something about Garrett's confidence troubled him deeply. The doctor's office was on the main street, a modest building with a shingle proclaiming Samuel Wilson, M.D., hanging beside the door. Morgan found the physician just finishing with a patient, a young mother with a fretful infant. Reeves, Wilson greeted him, surprised. "Rare to see you in town twice in 1 month. Nothing serious, I hope." "Need to talk?" Morgan said briefly. "In private." Wilson nodded, showing the young mother out with reassurances about her baby's cough, then closed the door firmly. "What's happened?" Morgan had always appreciated the doctor's directness. No small talk, no dancing around issues. It was one of the reasons they'd maintained a cordial if distant professional relationship over the years. "What do you know about a man named Theodore Garrett? Claims to represent a Reverend Caldwell from Virginia." Wilson's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, the man searching for the disturbed young woman. He came by yesterday, asking if I'd examined her. I told him I make it a policy not to discuss patients actual or potential." "What was your impression of him?" The doctor considered stroking his gray-streaked beard. unpleasant, struck me as the type who enjoys power over others, and his story about the Reverend's daughter seemed— He paused, searching for the right word. Convenient. Convenient how? Too neat, too rehearsed. Wilson shrugged. But then I'm naturally skeptical of men who claim to act in others' best interests while refusing to let them speak for themselves. Morgan felt a surge of relief. At least someone else saw through Garrett's facade. The woman he's looking for is at my ranch. Name's Sarah Grace, far as I know. Purchased her contract from a trader named Blackwood. The mute girl? Wilson looked surprised. I'd heard rumors, but, well, small towns and their gossip. She's not insane, Morgan said firmly, but she is in danger, I think. Her father, if he is her father, tried to kill her once before, cut her throat. That's why she can't speak. Wilson's expression darkened. That would explain the scar Garrett mentioned. He claimed it was from a suicide attempt, evidence of her disturbed mind. It's a lie. Everything he's saying is a lie. Morgan hesitated, then added, Sarah has abilities, unusual ones. She can communicate with animals somehow, heal them. It sounds impossible, I know, but I've seen it myself. To Morgan's surprise, Wilson didn't dismiss the claim outright. Instead, he looked thoughtful. There are many things in this world that science has yet to explain, Reeves. I've traveled enough to know that what seems impossible in one culture is accepted as ordinary in another. He paused. These abilities, are they what her father objected to? Called it witchcraft, according to Sarah. Had her mother killed for the same gift. Wilson's face grew grave. I see. And now he's found her again through this Garrett fellow. He tapped his fingers against his desk, thinking. What do you need from me? An independent medical assessment, Morgan replied. If Garrett produces commitment papers, I want you to examine Sarah. Confirm she's of sound mind. I can do that, Wilson agreed. But it may not be enough legally, especially if the Virginia courts have already ruled. It's something, Morgan insisted. And I need something, Wilson. I can't let her go back to a man who tried to murder her. The doctor studied Morgan with keen eyes. You've grown attached to this young woman. It wasn't a question, and Morgan didn't treat it as one. Will you help? Yes, Wilson said simply. Bring her to me when you can, preferably without an audience. Thank you. Morgan turned to go, then hesitated. One more thing. What do you know about Mayor Thompson? Would he side with a stranger over a local on a matter like this? Wilson's expression grew troubled. Ezekiel is complicated, deeply religious sometimes to the point of zealotry. But he's also protective of the town's independence, doesn't like outsiders telling Hopewell how to manage its affairs. He shrugged. Hard to say which instinct would win out. And his wife Eleanor, fragile, has been since they lost their son years ago. Tends to follow Ezekiel's lead in all things. Wilson gave Morgan a sharp look. Why, just trying to understand who might be influenced by Garrett's story. Morgan opened the door. I'll be in touch about bringing Sarah to see you. Reeves, Wilson called as Morgan stepped outside. Be careful. Men convinced they're doing God's work can be dangerous. I know, Morgan replied grimly. Believe me, I know. Morgan took a circuitous route back to Lone Star, watching carefully for any sign that he was being followed. The encounter with Garrett had left him uneasy, convinced that the man wasn't above using underhanded tactics to get what he wanted. As he approached the ranch, Morgan was startled to see a plume of dust rising from the direction of the main house. Riders moving fast. His heart rate quickened, and he urged Renegade into a gallop. By the time he crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, whoever had been there was gone. The yard appeared empty, The house quiet. Too quiet. Scout should have been barking at his approach. The chickens should have been pecking in the yard. "Sarah!" Morgan called, sliding from the saddle before Renegade had fully stopped. "Sarah, where are you?" No answer came. The front door of the main house stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, Morgan found signs of a hasty search, drawers, pulled out, papers scattered. His medical books, which he'd lent to Sarah, were strewn across the floor, as if someone had been looking for something hidden within them. Dread building in his chest, Morgan ran to Sarah's cabin. It too showed signs of intrusion. The bed overturned, her few possessions tossed aside. On the floor lay the slate he'd given her, cracked in two as if it had been stepped on. And there was blood, not much, just a few drops on the wooden floor, but enough to send ice through Morgan's veins. "Sarah!" he shouted again, desperation edging his voice. A faint sound answered him, not a human voice, but a low whine. Following it, Morgan found Scout under the cabin's small porch, crouched and trembling. The dog's left side was matted with blood from a shallow wound across his ribs, the kind made by a riding crop or quirt. "Easy, boy," Morgan murmured, kneeling to examine the injury. "What happened? Where's Sarah?" Scout whined again, struggling to his feet despite the pain. He limped toward the barn, looking back at Morgan expectantly. Heart pounding, Morgan followed. The barn doors stood wide open, hay and tools scattered, as if there had been a struggle. Scout led him to an empty stall at the far end, nosing at the straw insistently. At first, Morgan saw nothing unusual. Then a slight movement caught his eye, the straw shifting as if disturbed by a breath. He dropped to his knees, pushing the hay aside to reveal a small trap door cleverly concealed in the floor of the stall. Morgan had forgotten about this, a root cellar dug by the previous owner, unused since Morgan had purchased the property. He lifted the door to find Sarah huddled below, her eyes wide with fear, until she recognized him. "Thank God," Morgan breathed, reaching down to help her up. "Are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head, though Morgan noted fresh bruises on her wrists and a cut at the corner of her mouth. She was trembling, whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. "Who was it, Garrett?" She nodded, gesturing urgently toward the house, then making a writing motion with her hand. "You need to write something down." "All right, come on." They hurried back to the house, Scout limping behind them. Sarah found a pencil and paper among the scattered items and wrote rapidly, "3 men, Garrett and 2 others, looking for evidence. Said I stole something from Father." "What?" Sarah shook her head, bewildered. "Don't know. Kept asking about book or papers. Said I'd be punished when Father gets me back." Morgan's jaw tightened. "They won't get the chance. We're leaving." Sarah looked surprised, then wrote, "Where can we go? They'll find us." "I have a friend," Morgan said, already gathering supplies. "A former army comrade who has a place in the hill country about a day's ride from here. We'll be safe there until we can sort this out legally." Sarah hesitated, then wrote, "Can't run forever. He'll keep coming. We're not running forever, just long enough to get protection from the courts." Morgan paused in his preparations. "Unless, do you want to stay and fight this now?" Sarah's expression was conflicted. Finally, she wrote, "Need time. Need plan. Your friend's place is good for now." "Then that's what we'll do. Pack whatever you need. We leave in 10 minutes. As Sarah hurried to gather her few remaining possessions, Morgan quickly treated Scout's wound. The dog would heal, but Morgan's anger at the casual cruelty inflicted on the animal burned hot. What kind of men would harm a dog simply for protecting its home? The kind who would hunt down a young woman for the crime of being different. A voice in his mind answered. The kind who would burn a healer as a witch and call it God's justice. Morgan checked his firearms, the Colt at his hip, and the Winchester rifle he kept in a scabbard on his saddle. He had never been a violent man by nature, had seen too much death during the war to seek it out. But he would kill if necessary to protect Sarah. The certainty of this settled in him like a stone. By the time Sarah returned, a small bundle clutched in her arms, Morgan had saddled both Renegade and Thunder, the sturdy gelding he kept as a backup mount. He'd also packed food, water, ammunition, and basic medical supplies. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded, her face set in determined lines. She glanced at Scout, concern evident in her eyes. "He'll be all right," Morgan assured her. "Mrs. Abernathy from the next ranch checks on the place when I'm away. She'll look after him." Sarah knelt beside the dog, placing her hand gently on his head. She closed her eyes briefly, and Scout grew still, his pained panting easing. When she stood, the dog seemed more comfortable, settling down with a soft sigh. "Did you just—" Morgan began, still amazed by her abilities, despite having witnessed them before. Sarah shrugged slightly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Then she mounted Thunder with surprising grace, for someone raised far from horse country, and looked at Morgan expectantly. As they rode away from Lone Star, Morgan couldn't help glancing back at the place that had been his sanctuary for 5 years. He had no illusion that they would return to find it unchanged. Men like Garrett didn't give up easily, and a property left vacant was vulnerable. But buildings could be rebuilt. Land would wait. Some things mattered more. Sarah rode silently beside him, her face turned toward the horizon, the sun illuminating her profile with a golden light that made her seem almost ethereal. As if sensing his gaze, she turned to look at him, a question in her eyes. "We'll be all right," Morgan said, answering the unspoken concern. "Trust me." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of a solemn vow. She trusted him. Now he had to prove worthy of that trust. They rode hard through the day, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses. Morgan led them on a winding path through less traveled country, avoiding main roads and settlements where Garrett might have set watchers. By sunset, they were deep in the hill country where limestone ridges rose like the spines of sleeping giants, and cedar thickets provided natural concealment. Morgan's friend Elijah Harper had a small homestead tucked into a hidden valley accessible only by a narrow trail that wound between 2 steep hillsides. Harper had chosen the location deliberately, a man who valued his privacy almost as much as Morgan did, and for similar reasons. "He was a scout during the war," Morgan explained, as they picked their way down the trail in the fading light. "Best tracker in the Union Army. Saved my life more times than I can count." Sarah nodded, though Morgan could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders. The day's events had taken their toll, physical and emotional. "We're almost there," he encouraged. "Just around this bend." The cabin appeared suddenly, a solid structure of local stone and timber blending so naturally with its surroundings that one could pass within yards and never notice it. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, the only sign of habitation. Before they'd fully emerged from the trees, the cabin door opened and a man stepped out, a rifle held casually but ready in his hands. He was a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the deep brown of aged mahogany and close-cropped gray hair. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined around eyes that missed nothing. "Little far from home, aren't you, Reeves?" he called, his deep voice carrying easily in the quiet evening air. "Need a favor, Harper," Morgan replied, dismounting and approaching with his hands clearly visible. Harper's gaze shifted to Sarah, who remained on horseback, regarding him warily. "Kind of favor that involves pretty young women and men riding hard, if I'm reading the signs right." You always did read signs well. Harper lowered his rifle. Better come inside, then. Looks like you've got a story to tell. The interior of this cabin was simple but comfortable. One large room with a fireplace at one end, a cooking area at the other, and sleeping pallets along the back wall. Everything was meticulously clean and organized, a place for everything, and everything in its place. It smelled of wood-smoked coffee and the herbs that hung drying from the rafters. "Sit," Harper instructed, gesturing to a table made from a split log polished smooth by years of use. "You look dead on your feet, both of you." While Sarah and Morgan settled at the table, Harper moved to the fireplace where a pot of something fragrant simmered. He filled 3 bowls with a rich stew, set them on the table with spoons and a loaf of dark bread, then took a seat opposite his guests. "Eat first," he said firmly. "Talk after." The stew was delicious venison with wild onions, carrots, and herbs Morgan couldn't identify. Sarah ate cautiously at first, then with increasing appetite as her initial wariness of their host faded. Morgan, having known Harper for years, dug in without hesitation. When they'd finished, Harper collected the bowls and returned with a pot of coffee and 3 tin cups. "Now," he said, settling back into his chair, "let's hear it." Morgan explained the situation concisely: Sarah's rescue from Blackwood, the arrival of Garrett with his claims about Reverend Caldwell, the attack on the ranch. He didn't mention Sarah's abilities, feeling that was her secret to share or keep as she chose. Harper listened without interruption, his dark eyes occasionally flicking to Sarah, as if assessing her reaction to the story. When Morgan finished, Harper leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Complicated," he said finally. "This Garrett, he strikes me as the type who doesn't give up easy." "No," Morgan agreed. "And he's already got the mayor and half the town believing Sarah is some kind of dangerous lunatic." "She don't look dangerous to me," Harper observed. "Course it's often the quiet ones you got to watch out for." There was a hint of humor in his voice, a gentleness beneath the gruff exterior. Sarah, who had been following the conversation with careful attention, reached for the pencil and paper Morgan had given her before they left the ranch. She wrote briefly, then passed the note to Harper. "Thank you for shelter. Won't stay long. Don't want to bring trouble to you." Harper read it, then looked up at her with newfound respect. "Considerate, but unnecessary. Trouble and I are old acquaintances." He turned back to Morgan. "You're welcome to stay as long as needed, both of you. My home ain't fancy, but it's secure. Nobody finds this place unless I want them to." "Thank you," Morgan said simply. "We won't impose longer than necessary." Harper waved away the gratitude. "You saved my leg at Antietam when any other surgeon would have taken it off. Far as I'm concerned, I still owe you." Sarah wrote again. "You were doctor in war." Morgan nodded. "Army surgeon. That's how Harper and I met." "But you said you don't practice medicine anymore." "I don't." "Why, you have gift. I've seen your books, your knowledge." Morgan shifted uncomfortably. "That's a story for another time." Harper watched this exchange with interest. "Your young lady asks good questions, Reeves. Always did wonder why you hung up your scalpel." "She's not my young lady," Morgan said automatically. "And like I said, it's a story for another time." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, disappointment perhaps, or simple acceptance of yet another boundary. "Well," Harper said, rising from the table, "you both need rest. Lady can take my bed. Reeves and I will make do with pallets by the fire." Sarah shook her head emphatically and wrote, "Can't take your bed. Already imposing too much." "It's not imposing if it's offered freely," Harper replied. "Besides, I've slept on worse than my own floor." Sarah still hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with displacing their host. Morgan recognized the stubborn set of her jaw. "You're exhausted, Sarah," he said gently. "Take the bed, please." After a moment's more resistance, she relented, nodding her thanks to Harper. Later, as Morgan lay on his pallet staring at the rafters above, he could hear Harper's steady breathing from the other side of the hearth. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the cabin's interior. From the direction of the bed came the soft, regular breathing that told him Sarah had finally surrendered to sleep. Morgan envied her that peace. His own mind was too full for rest, racing with plans, contingencies, and a growing sense that they were entangled in something more dangerous than he'd initially realized. Garrett's desperation to find Sarah, the specific mention of a book or papers she supposedly stole. There was more to this story than a father's concern for a supposedly troubled daughter. "You awake, Reeves?" Harper's voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes. Your girl. She's got the sight, doesn't she?" Morgan turned his head, surprised. "What do you mean? Don't play dumb with me. I've seen how she connects with creatures. That hawk that's been following you all day ain't natural the way it kept pace." Morgan hadn't noticed any hawk, but he wasn't surprised that Harper had. The man missed nothing. "What if she does? No judgment here. My grandmother had it. Could talk to plants, know when storms were coming, heal sicknesses no doctor could touch." Harper's voice held a quiet reverence. "White folks called it witchcraft. We called it wisdom." "Her father called it witchcraft, too," Morgan said bitterly. "Had her mother killed for it." "Then you'd best be prepared for what's coming," Harper warned. "Men like that, they don't stop. Not ever. Not until they've destroyed what they fear." "I know," Morgan sighed heavily. "I just don't know how to fight this legally. If her father has papers declaring her incompetent, papers can be challenged, evidence presented." Harper was silent for a moment. "Dr. Wilson in town, he's a reasonable man. Get him to examine her, testify to her soundness of mind." "That's the plan. But will it be enough?" "Maybe, maybe not. But it's a start." Harper shifted on his pallet. "You care for her." It wasn't a question, and Morgan didn't treat it as one. "She's been through hell. Deserves a chance at peace." Harper's tone suggested he understood more than Morgan was saying. "Get some sleep, Reeves. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles." Morgan tried to follow the advice, but sleep remained elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face as she'd looked when Garrett's name was mentioned, the raw fear, the echo of old trauma. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of soldiers who'd endured battle after battle, until something inside them broke. Sarah Grace wasn't broken, though. Wounded, yes. Scarred, certainly. But not broken. There was a resilience in her that awed him, a quiet strength that had allowed her to survive horrors that would have destroyed many. And now, she was his responsibility. Not just because he'd purchased her contract, not just because he'd promised to protect her, but because something in him recognized something in her, a kindred spirit, perhaps. Another soul who had stared into darkness and chosen to keep walking. With that thought, Morgan finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the weight of his Colt, a reassuring presence at his side. Morgan woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet conversation. Opening his eyes, he was surprised to see Sarah sitting at the table with Harper, a slate between them. Harper had evidently found it somewhere in his collection of odds and ends, giving Sarah a way to communicate more easily. "Morning," Harper greeted, noticing Morgan's awakening. "Your lady friend here's been telling me about her gift with animals. Fascinating." Sarah glanced at Morgan, a hint of apology in her eyes. She wrote on the slate, "Had to explain." He already knew. "It's all right," Morgan assured her, sitting up and running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. Harper's about the most trustworthy man I know. High praise coming from you, Harper said dryly. He poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Morgan. Drink up, we've got planning to do. Over breakfast, cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses, they discussed their options. Harper, it turned out, had connections in San Antonio, including a judge who might be sympathetic to their situation. Judge Abrams is fair-minded, Harper explained. Doesn't hold with the kind of religious fervor that leads to witch hunts. If we can get Sarah's case before him with Dr. Wilson's testimony, we might have a chance. How long would it take to arrange a hearing? Morgan asked. Week, maybe 2. I'd need to send a message. Harper glanced out the window, his expression calculating. Got a friend rides for the stage company. Could get word to him today. Have him carry a letter to San Antonio. Sarah wrote on her slate, What about Garrett? He's looking for us now. Let him look, Harper said firmly. Nobody finds this valley unless I want them to. But Sarah shook her head, writing not safe to stay in one place. He has trackers. Dogs, maybe. Harper looked impressed. Smart thinking. But I know every trail, every hidden path in 50 miles. We can move around. Stay ahead of them. Morgan considered their options. If we can hold out for 2 weeks, get a hearing before Judge Abrams, it might work. Sarah wrote again, her expression troubled. What if Father comes himself? He has power over people, makes them believe him. Charisma, Harper translated. Dangerous weapon in the wrong hands. All the more reason to get legal protection first, Morgan insisted. If we confront him directly without the law on our side, we'll lose. Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly, but she nodded in reluctant agreement. She wrote, 2 weeks then, but need to prepare for worst. Father won't give up easily. We'll be ready, Morgan promised, for whatever comes. Harper rose from the table. I'll ride out, contact my friend with the stage line. You two stay here, keep out of sight. Back before sundown. After Harper left, a strange awkwardness fell between Morgan and Sarah. Without their host as a buffer, the small cabin suddenly seemed much more intimate. Their unusual circumstances more apparent. Morgan busied himself cleaning up after breakfast, while Sarah moved to the doorway, staring out at the beautiful valley with its lush spring growth. After a while, she returned to the table and wrote on the slate, Tell me about Caroline. The request caught Morgan off guard. What? Your wife. You mentioned her once. Said she died with your son. Morgan's first instinct was to refuse to change the subject or simply walk away. He'd never discussed Caroline with anyone, not even Harper, who had known him during that time. The loss was too personal, too raw, even after all these years. But something in Sarah's steady gaze made him reconsider. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she too had suffered devastating loss. Perhaps it was simply time. She was a schoolteacher, he said finally, the words coming slowly at first. Smartest person I ever knew. Could recite Shakespeare and calculate complex equations with equal ease. Always believed I could be more than I was. Sarah nodded encouragingly. We met in Philadelphia. I was in medical school, she was teaching at a girls' academy. Her father didn't approve, wanted her to marry a banker or lawyer, not a doctor with uncertain prospects. But Caroline... Morgan smiled faintly at the memory. She never did what was expected if she thought there was a better way. He paused, the familiar ache of loss rising in his chest. We had 3 good years. I established a practice. We had a little house near the park. She helped in my office, sometimes keeping records, comforting patients. We wanted children, but it didn't happen right away. Sarah wrote, What went wrong? Everything and nothing, Morgan said softly. The pregnancy seemed normal at first. Caroline was radiant, so excited. But in the 7th month, she developed preeclampsia, dangerous high blood pressure. I should have seen the signs earlier, should have... He shook his head. By the time I realized how serious it was too late. She went into labor early. There were complications. I couldn't save either of them. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. On the slate, she wrote, "Not your fault. Some things beyond even a doctor's control." "That's what they all said," Morgan replied, the bitterness of old grief in his voice. "But I was her doctor, her husband. I should have protected them." Sarah squeezed his hand, then wrote, "Guilt is poison that keeps wounds open. Believe me, I know." Morgan looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then wrote, "Blamed myself for Mother's death. If I hadn't had Gift, if I hadn't defended her, maybe Father wouldn't have turned against her." "That's different," Morgan protested. "You were a child. You didn't cause what happened." Sarah gave him a pointed look, then wrote, "Neither did you. Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts." The simple truth of her words struck Morgan with unexpected force. How many times had he told patients' families the same thing when medicine failed? How many times had he recognized the limits of human ability for everyone except himself? "Maybe," he conceded, "but it doesn't make it easier to bear." Sarah nodded understanding in her eyes. She wrote, "Nothing makes loss easier. We just learn to carry it differently, find purpose beyond pain." "Is that what you've done?" Morgan asked quietly. She considered the question, then wrote, "Trying to. Each day. Sometimes fail, but still try." Her honesty touched something in Morgan that had been closed off for years. This woman who had every reason to surrender to bitterness and despair, instead chose to keep moving forward, to find meaning beyond her suffering. It humbled him. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah Grace," he said softly. She shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. She wrote, "Not strong, stubborn, like someone else I know." Despite everything, the danger they faced, the uncertainty of their future, Morgan found himself smiling back. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the weight of his past seemed a little lighter, a little more bearable. The moment was interrupted by a sound from outside, the soft whicker of a horse that wasn't Harper's. Instantly alert, Morgan moved to the window, carefully peering out without showing himself. 2 riders on the ridge above the valley, partially hidden by cedar trees. From this distance, Morgan couldn't identify them, but their presence in this remote location couldn't be coincidence. "Trouble," he said quietly, reaching for his Colt. "Looks like Garrett found us sooner than expected." Morgan moved with the quiet efficiency of a soldier gathering his rifle and ammunition, while Sarah quickly collected their few belongings. Years of military experience had taught him to assess threats quickly. 2 riders meant scouts, not a full search party. They were looking, not attacking. Not yet. "Back door," he whispered, gesturing toward the rear of Harper's cabin. "There's a path through the cedars. If we move now, we can get to the ridge on the eastern side before they spot us." Sarah nodded, slinging a small pack over her shoulder. She paused only to write hastily on the slate, "What about Harper?" "He can take care of himself," Morgan assured her. "And he knows these hills better than anyone. He'll find us." They slipped out the back door and into the dense cedar thicket that grew almost against the cabin wall. Morgan led the way, moving as silently as possible through the undergrowth, pausing frequently to listen for pursuit. Sarah followed close behind her footsteps, remarkably quiet, for someone who hadn't spent a lifetime in the wilderness. The path, barely discernible even to Morgan's experienced eye, wound through the cedars and up a steep, rocky slope. It was slow going. Every step had to be placed carefully to avoid dislodging stones that might give away their position. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, and soon both were sweating, despite the spring chill still lingering in the shadowed places. When they reached the ridgeline, Morgan pulled Sarah down beside him behind the shelter of a large boulder. From this vantage point, they could see Harper's cabin below, and the two riders Morgan had spotted earlier. "Garrett's men," Sarah wrote on a scrap of paper, not wanting to risk using the slate, which might reflect sunlight. Morgan studied the distant figures through narrowed eyes. "Can't tell from here, but they're moving with purpose, not like casual travelers." The riders had dismounted and were examining the ground around the cabin. One disappeared inside while the other led the horses to a small stream nearby. Even at this distance, the methodical nature of their search was evident. "They're looking for signs," Morgan murmured. "Tracks. Evidence of our passing." Sarah's expression was grim as she wrote, "They'll find the fresh coffee. Know we were here recently." "Yes, but they won't know which way we went," Morgan replied. "Harper has a trick of obscuring trails around his place, unless they're exceptional trackers." He broke off as the man who had entered the cabin emerged, gesturing urgently to his companion. Even without hearing words, the excitement in his movements was clear. He'd found something. "We need to move," Morgan said. "Now." They retreated from the ridgeline, working their way eastward through the hills. Morgan set a grueling pace, driven by the knowledge that skilled pursuers were now on their trail. Sarah kept up without complaint. Though Morgan could see the strain beginning to tell in the tightness around her eyes, the occasional stumble on rough ground. By midday, they had put several miles between themselves and Harper's cabin, following game trails and dry creek beds that would, Morgan hoped, make tracking difficult. They paused in the shadow of a limestone overhang to rest and drink sparingly from their canteens. "How are you holding up?" Morgan asked, noting the pallor beneath Sarah's sun-flushed skin. She managed a small smile and wrote, "I'm fine. Stronger than I look." It was true, Morgan reflected. For someone raised in Virginia, far from the rigors of the Texas frontier, she showed remarkable endurance. Still, they couldn't continue at this pace indefinitely. They needed a destination, a plan beyond simply running. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah wrote, "Where are we going?" Morgan hesitated. He'd been operating on instinct, focused only on immediate escape. "There's a line shack about 6 miles east of here, used by cattlemen during roundup. Should be empty this time of year. We can rest there, wait for Harper." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained troubled. She wrote, "What if Harper is caught? What if they make him tell where we went?" "Harper's not easily caught," Morgan said with more confidence than he felt. "And he's even less easily made to talk." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. After a brief rest, they continued their journey, moving more cautiously now, aware that the terrain offered less cover as they descended from the hills toward the more open country where the line shack was located. The sun was low in the western sky when they finally spotted the small structure nestled against a rise of land. Built of rough-hewn timber with a sod roof, the line shack was primitive, but offered shelter and, more importantly, a defensible position with clear sightlines in all directions. Morgan approached cautiously, rifle-ready alert for any sign that others might have reached the place before them. But the shack appeared undisturbed, the door secured with a simple wooden latch, a layer of undisturbed dust on the lone windowsill. Inside the space was Spartan, a plank table. 2 three-legged stools, a crude hearth, and bunks built into the wall. It smelled of old smoked leather and the faint lingering odor of men who worked cattle for weeks without access to proper bathing facilities. "Home sweet home," Morgan said wryly, setting down his rifle and shrugging off his pack. at least for tonight. Sarah surveyed their temporary shelter with a practical eye, then immediately set about making it more habitable. She swept the floor with a bundle of dried grass, cleared spiderwebs from corners, and arranged their meager supplies with an efficiency that spoke of long practice in making do with little. Morgan checked their perimeter, satisfying himself that they had left minimal sign of their passage. As the last light faded from the sky, he returned to find Sarah had prepared a cold meal from their supplies and was heating water in a battered tin pot she'd found in the shack. "No fire," Morgan cautioned. "Smoke might be seen." Sarah nodded her understanding, pointing to the small oil lamp she'd discovered and lit instead. Its feeble glow barely illuminated the interior of the shack, but it was better than complete darkness. They ate in silence, both too exhausted for conversation, even if Sarah had been able to speak. When they finished, Morgan took the first watch, settling near the door with his rifle across his knees, while Sarah curled up on one of the bunks wrapped in the single blanket they'd brought from Harper's cabin. Despite her evident exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily to Sarah. Morgan could see her tossing restlessly, her breathing uneven. Finally, she rose and came to sit beside him, her slate in hand. "Can't sleep. Too many thoughts." "I understand," Morgan said softly. "Try to rest anyway. We've got a long day tomorrow." She hesitated, then wrote, "Tell me about your son, the one who died with Caroline. Did you name him?" The question caught Morgan off guard. No one had ever asked about his son before. Most people focused on Caroline, as if the unborn child had been merely an extension of his mother, not a separate life to be mourned. "James," Morgan said after a moment. "We were going to call him James after Caroline's father. Trying to mend that relationship, I suppose." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. She wrote, "He knows you loved him." "Still do." Morgan stared at her, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. "What do you mean?" Sarah looked uncertain, as if regretting her words. Finally, she wrote, "Sometimes I sense presences. Not just animals, people who have passed. Not clearly, just impressions, feelings." "Are you saying you can sense my son's spirit?" Morgan's voice was strained. Sarah shook her head quickly, writing, "Not exactly. More like echoes. Strong emotions leave marks. Your love for them both, it's still here, still part of you. They feel it." Morgan didn't know what to make of this. The rational, scientific part of his mind, the doctor trained in anatomy and physiology, rejected such notions as superstition. But another part, perhaps the part that had witnessed too many inexplicable moments between life and death on battlefields, wasn't so quick to dismiss her words. "I don't know if I believe that," he said honestly. "But thank you, I suppose, for telling me." Sarah smiled faintly, touching his hand briefly in acknowledgement. Then she wrote, "Should try to sleep now. Tomorrow will be difficult." "Yes," Morgan agreed, relieved to return to practical matters. "Get some rest. I'll wake you for your watch in a few hours." Sarah returned to her bunk, and this time sleep seemed to come more easily. Morgan watched her for a while, wondering at the strange turns his life had taken since that stormy night when a silent young woman had led him to shelter. The night passed without incident. Morgan woke Sarah for her turn at watch, then slept fitfully, his soldier's instincts keeping him alert, even in slumber. Dawn found them both awake, sharing the last of their food and planning their next move. "We need supplies," Morgan said, studying the crude map Harper had drawn for him months ago during a hunting trip. "There's a small trading post about 10 miles southeast of here. Not much more than a way station for travelers, but they should have basic provisions." Sarah frowned, writing dangerous to be seen. "I know, but we can't live on air and good intentions." Morgan folded the map carefully. "I'll go alone. You stay here. Keep hidden. I should be back by midday." Sarah's expression made it clear she didn't like this plan, but she couldn't deny the necessity. She wrote, "Be careful." Garrett could have men watching such places. "I'll be careful," Morgan promised. "Keep the door barred while I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone but me." Sarah nodded, her face solemn. As Morgan prepared to leave, checking his weapons and gathering the few coins he had, she suddenly caught his arm. Her eyes, intense and worried, held his for a long moment. Then she released him and stepped back, the gesture eloquent in its restraint. The 10-mile journey to the trading post took longer than Morgan anticipated. He avoided the main trail, taking a circuitous route that offered more cover but added miles to the journey. The trading post, when he finally reached it, was exactly as he remembered: a squat, weather-beaten building with a corral for horses and a few rough benches under an awning where travelers could rest. Morgan approached cautiously, scanning the area for unfamiliar horses or men who might be watching for him. There were only 2 horses tied to the hitching post, a bay mare and a paint gelding that he recognized as belonging to local ranchers. Still, he kept his hat pulled low and his manner unremarkable as he entered the store. The proprietor, a grizzled old-timer named Simmons, barely glanced up from his newspaper as Morgan gathered the supplies he needed: flour, coffee, salt pork, ammunition, and a few other essentials. The only other customer was a weather-beaten cowhand who was haggling half-heartedly over the price of tobacco. Morgan had almost allowed himself to relax when the door opened, admitting a tall figure silhouetted against the bright midday light. Every muscle in Morgan's body tensed as Theodore Garrett stepped into the trading post. For a moment, Morgan thought the man hadn't seen him. Garrett moved to the counter, speaking to Simmons in a low voice. Morgan turned away, pulling his hat lower, and continued examining a shelf of canned goods as if deeply fascinated by the selection. "Reeves!" The quiet voice froze Morgan in place. Slowly he turned to find Garrett watching him with those cold, calculating eyes. "Quite a coincidence." Garrett continued, his thin lips stretched in what might charitably be called a smile. "Finding you here so far from your ranch." "Just passing through," Morgan replied evenly. "Heading south." "South?" Garrett raised an eyebrow. "How interesting. I received information suggesting you and Miss Caldwell were hiding in the hills to the north." Morgan's hand drifted toward his holster. "Information can be wrong." "Indeed it can." Garrett glanced around the small store. "And where is the young lady now? Surely you haven't abandoned her." "She's no concern of yours," Morgan said, his voice hardening. "I've seen no proof she's who you claim she is." "Ah, but I have proof now." Garrett reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. A sworn affidavit from her father, including a detailed description of identifying marks that should settle the matter conclusively. The sheriff is quite satisfied with it. Morgan didn't reach for the paper. "Then take it to a judge. Let the law decide." "That's precisely what I intend to do." Garrett tucked the document back into his coat. "Judge Thompson has agreed to hear the case tomorrow morning. I was hoping to spare Miss Caldwell the embarrassment of a public hearing by resolving this privately, but if you insist on formalities—" "Judge Thompson, Mayor Thompson's brother." Morgan's heart sank. If Ezekiel Thompson had influenced his brother, any hearing would be a mere formality before Sarah was handed over to Garrett. "And if I choose not to bring her?" Morgan asked, testing. Garrett's smile widened a fraction. "Then you would be in violation of a court order, a fugitive from justice. I don't think you want that, Mr. Reeves, not with your history." The implied threat was clear. Somehow Garrett had learned about Morgan's past, perhaps from Sheriff Jenkins, perhaps through other sources. Either way, he was leveraging that knowledge now. "Tomorrow morning," Garrett repeated. 10 o'clock at the courthouse in Hopewell Junction. "I trust you'll do the right thing, Mr. Reeves." He tipped his hat with mocking courtesy and left the store, the door swinging shut behind him. Morgan stood frozen for a moment, mind racing. Garrett had found them, or at least found him, but the man hadn't attempted an arrest, hadn't brought men to force the issue. "Why, you in some kind of trouble, Reeves?" Simmons asked, breaking into Morgan's thoughts. "Nothing I can't handle," Morgan replied automatically. He paid for his supplies quickly, eager to be gone before Garrett could return with reinforcements. Outside there was no sign of Garrett or his horse. Morgan mounted Renegade and set off, but instead of returning directly to the line shack, he took a winding path through the hills, watching carefully for pursuit. Only when he was certain he wasn't being followed did he turn toward their temporary shelter. The sun was low in the western sky by the time Morgan reached the line shack. He approached cautiously, alert for any sign of disturbance, but everything appeared as he had left it. "Sarah," he called softly, dismounting near the door. "It's Morgan." The door remained closed. No response came from within. "Sarah." Morgan tried again, a tendril of unease uncurling in his stomach. He moved to the small window, peering inside. The shack was empty. Heart pounding, Morgan pushed open the door, rifle ready. The interior was undisturbed. Sarah's few possessions still neatly arranged, no sign of a struggle. But on the table lay her slate, and on it, written in her careful hand, "Gone to protect you. Don't follow. Thank you for everything. S." "No," Morgan whispered the single word containing a world of denial. "No, no, no." He burst back outside, scanning the surroundings for any trace of her passage. In the dying light, he could just make out footprints leading away from the shack, not toward Hopewell Junction or Harper's cabin, but east toward the wilderness beyond. Sarah had run, alone, without supplies or protection into country she didn't know. Morgan didn't hesitate. He grabbed only what was essential: water, ammunition, a blanket, and mounted Renegade. The mare was tired from the day's journey, but she responded willingly to his urgency. As darkness fell, Morgan followed Sarah's trail by instinct as much as skill. She had made no effort to hide her passage, moving with the single-minded purpose of someone who believed speed more important than stealth. But where was she going? What had prompted this desperate flight? The answer came to Morgan with sudden clarity. Garrett. Somehow Sarah had learned of Morgan's encounter with the man at the trading post. Perhaps she had sensed it the same way she seemed to sense animals in distress. Or perhaps... Morgan reined in sharply, scanning the darkness around him. Of course, Garrett had known exactly where to find him because he had already found Sarah. The meeting at the trading post hadn't been chance, it had been a calculated move to separate them. "Sarah!" Morgan shouted, caution forgotten in his rising panic. "Sarah, where are you?" Only the whispering night wind answered him. Morgan pressed on, following the increasingly faint trail as it wound through scrubland and dry creek beds. Renegades stumbled occasionally in the darkness, forcing him to slow their pace. By midnight, even Morgan's experienced eye could no longer discern Sarah's tracks in the moonlit landscape. He was forced to make camp, though every instinct screamed against the delay. As he sat beside a small, carefully shielded fire, Morgan faced the crushing weight of failure. He had promised to protect Sarah, and instead he had left her vulnerable. Whether she had fled of her own accord or been taken by Garrett's men, the result was the same: she was gone, and he had no idea how to find her. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no rest. Morgan's dreams were haunted by Sarah's face, her eyes filled with the same fear he'd seen when Garrett's name was first mentioned. In the dream, she tried to speak, her lips forming words he couldn't hear, her hands reaching for him across an ever-widening chasm. He woke before dawn, cold and stiff, with a sense of urgency that propelled him back into the saddle before the eastern sky had begun to lighten. Without a clear trail to follow, Morgan had to rely on logic and intuition. If Sarah had truly fled to protect him, where would she go? Not back to Virginia, surely. Not to any populated area where Garrett might find her. No, she would seek wilderness isolation, a place where her strange abilities would be an asset rather than a liability. The mountains to the west, perhaps, or the vast empty expanses of the plains to the north. But she couldn't have gone far on foot in a single day. And if Garrett's men had taken her, Morgan's jaw tightened at the thought. If they had her, they would be taking her to Hopewell Junction for the hearing, which meant he had until 10 o'clock to find her and prevent her from being handed over to her father. With renewed determination, Morgan turned renegade toward town. Whether Sarah had run or been captured, all paths now led to Hopewell Junction. The courthouse in Hopewell Junction was an imposing structure of local limestone, its steps worn by the passage of countless boots over the years. By 9:30, on the morning of the hearing, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by rumors of an unusual case involving the reclusive Morgan Reeves and a mysterious young woman. Morgan, having ridden through the night, arrived just as Sheriff Jenkins was opening the courthouse doors. He dismounted stiffly, his body protesting the long hours in the saddle, his mind foggy from exhaustion and worry. "Reeves?" Jenkins greeted him, surprise evident in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Where is she?" Morgan demanded, dispensing with pleasantries. Jenkins frowned. "Who?" "Sarah Grace, Sarah Caldwell, whatever you're calling her. Where is she?" "How would I know? Thought she was with you." Jenkins studied Morgan's haggard appearance. "You look like Hell Reeves. What happened?" "Garrett happened," Morgan said grimly. "He found us. Or found me, at least. When I got back to where Sarah was hiding, she was gone." "Gone?" Jenkins's frown deepened. "Garrett didn't say anything about having found her. Just that he had new evidence and was confident you'd both appear for the hearing." Morgan's exhausted mind struggled to make sense of this. If Garrett didn't have Sarah and she wasn't with Morgan, "I need to find Dr. Wilson," Morgan said abruptly. "Is he here?" "Should be in his office this time of morning," Jenkins replied, "but the hearing starts in half an hour. Judge Thompson doesn't like to be kept waiting." "The hell with Judge Thompson," Morgan muttered, already turning toward the doctor's office. He found Wilson just finishing with a patient, a young mother with a fretful infant. The doctor looked up in surprise as Morgan burst in. "Reeves? What on earth?" "Sarah's missing," Morgan interrupted. "I need your help." Wilson dismissed his patient with a few reassuring words, then turned his full attention to Morgan. "Tell me what happened." Morgan explained the events of the past days, their flight to Harper's cabin, the pursuit, his encounter with Garrett at the trading post, and Sarah's disappearance. "And you're certain Garrett doesn't have her?" Wilson asked when he finished. "According to Jenkins, no." Morgan ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "But she left a note saying she was leaving to protect me. It doesn't make sense. She knows she's safer with me than alone." Wilson was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Unless she learned something that made her believe otherwise." "What do you mean? Think about it, Reeves. This young woman has spent years in hiding, terrified of being found by her father. She finally begins to trust you to believe she might be safe. Then suddenly, she runs, leaving only a cryptic note about protecting you." Wilson leaned forward. "What would make her do that?" "A threat," Morgan realized slowly. "Someone threatened her. Or, more likely, threatened me." "Exactly." Wilson nodded. "Now who would know exactly what kind of threat would most effectively separate her from your protection?" "Her father," Morgan whispered, a cold certainty settling in his gut. Reverend Caldwell is here. It would explain much, Wilson agreed. Garrett's confidence, Sarah's sudden flight. The question is, where would she go if she were trying to ensure your safety while avoiding her father? Morgan's mind raced, retracing their conversation, searching for any clue. She mentioned once that churches made her uncomfortable, said they reminded her of— He broke off, the answer suddenly clear. The abandoned chapel, north of town on the old Mission Road. It burned years ago, but the shell is still standing. Why would she go there? To face her demons, Morgan said grimly, to end this on her terms, not his. Wilson glanced at the clock on his wall. The hearing starts in 20 minutes. If you're right and Reverend Caldwell is here, he'll be at the courthouse soon. I need to find Sarah before that happens. Morgan moved toward the door, then paused. Wilson, if I'm not back in time. I'll do what I can to delay proceedings, the doctor promised. But Judge Thompson is firmly in Mayor Thompson's camp on this matter, and the mayor seems unusually invested in supporting Garrett's claims. Why would Thompson care about a stranger from Virginia? Wilson's expression was grave. Religious fervor, perhaps, or something more pragmatic. I've heard rumors that Reverend Caldwell's church is considering establishing a mission here. Such an enterprise would bring money influence and validate Thompson's own religious standing, Morgan concluded. Politics and piety, a dangerous combination. Indeed, Wilson clasped Morgan's shoulder briefly. Be careful, Reeves. Men who believe they're doing God's work rarely scruple about their methods. With a nod of acknowledgement, Morgan left, hurrying toward where he'd left Renegade. The mare was exhausted, but she responded gamely when he mounted and turned her toward the North Road. As they galloped out of town, Morgan was acutely aware of the passing minutes, of the forces gathering at the courthouse, of the vulnerability of one young woman facing her nightmares alone. The old mission chapel stood on a low hill about 2 miles north of Hopewell Junction. Built by Spanish missionaries a century earlier and abandoned after a fire in the 1850s, it was now little more than a roofless shell of blackened stone walls. Local children sometimes dared each other to spend the night among the ruins, claiming the place was haunted by the ghosts of converted Indians who had died there of smallpox. Morgan approached cautiously, Renegade's hooves muffled by the spring grass that had reclaimed the old Mission Road. The chapel came into view as he crested a small rise, its broken walls stark against the morning sky, a solitary figure standing in what had once been the nave. Sarah. She stood with her back to him, facing the remains of the altar. Her posture was rigid, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, moving slightly in the gentle breeze. She appeared to be alone, but Morgan kept his hand near his revolver as he dismounted and approached on foot. Sarah, he called softly when he was still several yards away, not wanting to startle her. She turned her face, showing no surprise at his presence. She had expected him to find her. Perhaps had been counting on it. Morgan closed the distance between them, relief warring with concern as he noted her pallor, the shadows beneath her eyes. Are you all right? Why did you leave? Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper. She handed it to Morgan, her expression grim. The note was written in an elegant, flowing script. My dear daughter, you have evaded me long enough. I have come to Texas to reclaim what is mine, your immortal soul. Mr. Reeves, though misguided, seems a decent man. It would be regrettable if his interference resulted in his destruction, both legal and spiritual. Come to the old mission chapel at dawn tomorrow, if you wish to spare him. Come alone. This is between us as it has always been. Your father in flesh and in Christ, Josiah Caldwell. Morgan looked up from the paper, anger burning through his exhaustion. When did you get this? Sarah held up 2 fingers. 2 days ago. While I was at the trading post, Morgan realized. He sent men to the line shack. You went willingly to protect me. She nodded, her eyes conveying what her voice could not, that she would do it again, that his safety mattered more to her than her own. Sarah, Morgan said gently, you don't need to protect me. That's not how this works. We protect each other. A sad smile touched her lips. She shook her head slightly, then gestured around the ruined chapel and toward the road leading back to town. Your father, Morgan interpreted. You're saying he's on his way here. She nodded, her expression resolute. Then we leave. Now. Before he arrives. Sarah shook her head emphatically, pointing to herself, then to the ground. She was staying. This would end here. I won't let him take you, Morgan insisted. I won't let him hurt you again. Sarah touched his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. The gesture held such tenderness that Morgan found himself speechless. Then she stepped back and lifted her hands, beginning a series of gestures he had never seen before. Fluid, graceful movements that seemed almost like a dance. What are you doing? He asked, confused. She's praying, came a deep voice from behind them. In her own heathen way. Morgan whirled his hand, going to his revolver. A man stood in the chapel entrance, tall and imposing, in a black frock coat with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His face might have been handsome, if not for the hardness in his eyes, the cruel set of his mouth. Reverend Caldwell, I presume, Morgan said coldly. And you must be Morgan Reeves. Caldwell's voice was rich and resonant, the voice of a man accustomed to commanding attention from a pulpit. I see my wayward daughter has ensnared you as she has so many others. The only snare here is the one you've set, Morgan replied, using threats to force her to meet you alone. Caldwell smiled thinly. Merely a father's concern for his child's spiritual welfare. Sarah has always been susceptible to darker influences. Sarah had gone very still, her face expressionless, but Morgan could see the rapid pulse at her throat, the slight tremor in her hands. She was terrified, yet she stood her ground. She seems perfectly sound to me, Morgan said, and perfectly clear about not wanting to return with you. She is ill, Mr. Reeves, has been since childhood. Her mother's influence, Caldwell's voice hardened. Abigail filled her head with pagan nonsense, taught her to commune with beasts rather than with God. I tried to save them both. Abigail refused salvation. I pray Sarah will not make the same choice. You murdered your wife, Morgan said bluntly, and tried to murder your daughter. There was no salvation in what you did, Reverend, only cruelty and fear. Anger flashed in Caldwell's eyes, quickly masked by a facade of pious concern. You have been deceived by a disturbed mind, Mr. Reeves. My wife died in a tragic accident. Sarah's throat was injured when she tried to take her own life in her grief. Lies, Morgan spat. I've seen the scar. That was no suicide attempt. That was the work of a man intent on silencing a witness. Caldwell sighed heavily as if disappointed by Morgan's obstinacy. I had hoped to resolve this peacefully for Sarah's sake, but I see she has poisoned your mind against me. He turned slightly, raising his voice. Mr. Garrett, if you please. Theodore Garrett stepped into the chapel, a revolver in his hand. Behind him came 2 more men, both armed. Reverend, Garrett acknowledged with a slight bow. I see you found your daughter as expected. With Mr. Reeves, no less, Caldwell said. "How fortunate. Now we can resolve both matters at once." Morgan's mind raced, assessing their options. He was armed but outnumbered 3-1. Sarah stood vulnerable beside him, her back to the remains of the altar, nowhere to run. "There's a hearing scheduled for 10 o'clock, Morgan said, playing for time. "Let the law decide this matter." "The law has already decided," Garrett replied smoothly. "Judge Thompson signed the commitment papers this morning. Sarah Caldwell is officially remanded to her father's custody." Without even seeing her, without a medical examination, Morgan's outrage was genuine. "That's not justice. That's corruption." "It is God's will," Caldwell interjected. "My daughter's soul must be saved whatever the cost." Sarah suddenly moved, stepping forward to stand directly before her father. Though her face was pale with fear, her posture was defiant. She pointed to the scar on her throat, then directly at Caldwell, her accusation unmistakable. For a moment, the Reverend's mask slipped, revealing a cold fury that confirmed every suspicion Morgan had harbored. "You dare accuse me," Caldwell hissed, "after everything I've done for you." Sarah nodded, unflinching despite her obvious terror. "Enough of this," Garrett interrupted. "Reverend, take your daughter. My men will deal with Reeves." "What exactly does deal with mean?" Morgan asked, his hand inching toward his holster. Garrett smiled unpleasantly. "Nothing permanent. Just enough to ensure you don't interfere further. A few broken bones, perhaps. Enough to keep you occupied while the Reverend and his daughter return to Virginia." "I don't think so," Morgan said quietly, calculating distances, angles, odds. 3-1. Not good, but he'd faced worse during the war. Before he could draw his weapon, however, Sarah did something unexpected. She stepped between Morgan and Garrett, her back to Morgan, facing the 3 armed men and her father. She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, then pointed to herself and to the chapel entrance. "She's offering to go willingly," Caldwell translated, satisfaction evident in his voice. "If you leave Mr. Reeves unharmed." Sarah nodded confirmation, her eyes pleading with Garrett. "A touching sacrifice," Garrett said dryly, "but unnecessary. Mr. Reeves will not be following you to Virginia one way or another." "Now wait just a minute," came a new voice from the chapel entrance. All heads turned to see Sheriff Jenkins standing there, his own revolver drawn. Beside him stood Dr. Wilson, and to Morgan's surprise, Elijah Harper. "This is a private family matter, Sheriff," Caldwell said smoothly. "I'm simply retrieving my daughter." With 3 armed men and threats against a local rancher, Jenkins shook his head. "Doesn't look like a family reunion to me." "I have legal authority," Garrett insisted, producing a folded document from his coat. "Signed by Judge Thompson this morning." "Interesting," Wilson commented, "considering Judge Thompson hasn't arrived in town yet. His coach was delayed by a washed-out bridge near Austin." Garrett's expression flickered. "Mayor Thompson, then, acting in his brother's stead." "Mayor Thompson has no judicial authority," Jenkins pointed out, "and even if he did, a commitment hearing requires the presence of the person in question and a medical examination." He glanced at Sarah. "Miss Grace appears to be standing right here, and as far as I know, no doctor has declared her incompetent." "This is absurd," Caldwell thundered. "She is my daughter, my blood, my responsibility before God." "She's also a grown woman," Wilson replied calmly. "And in Texas, we generally allow grown women to make their own decisions." The standoff hung in the air, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. Garrett and his men still had their weapons, as did Jenkins. Morgan stood ready to draw, calculating his odds, now improved, but still dangerous. It was Sarah who broke the impasse. With deliberate movements, she stepped forward again, placing herself directly before her father. She met his gaze steadily, then reached up to pull aside the collar of her dress, fully exposing the jagged scar across her throat. Then, to everyone's shock, she spoke. The sound that emerged was not a proper voice, more a harsh, broken whisper, forced through damaged vocal cords. But the words were clear enough. "You did this." Caldwell recoiled as if struck. "Impossible," he gasped. "You cannot speak. Your voice was taken. I made sure of it." "Not all," Sarah rasped. "Not enough." "Witchcraft," Caldwell hissed, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and rage. "The devil still has his hooks in you." "No," Sarah whispered. "Truth has hooks. Truth will be heard." She turned to face the others, her tortured voice gaining strength with each word, as if years of enforced silence were finally breaking like a dam. "He killed. My mother burned. Our home cut. My throat left. Me to die." "Lies," Caldwell shouted. "All lies." "I believe her," Jenkins said quietly. "Reverend Caldwell, you and Mr. Garrett are under arrest on suspicion of assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder." Garrett's face hardened. "Don't be a fool, Sheriff. There are 3 of us and only 2 of you." "Of 3?" Harper corrected, stepping forward with a shotgun that had been concealed beneath his coat. "And I rarely miss at this range." For a tense moment, it seemed Garrett might risk a shootout. Then, with obvious reluctance, he lowered his weapon. His men, taking their cue from him, did the same. "This isn't over," Caldwell warned, his eyes fixed on Sarah with venomous hatred. "God will not be mocked. Your sins will find you out." "Seems to me," Harper observed dryly, "that it's your sins doing the finding, Reverend." Jenkins moved forward to disarm Garrett and his men, while Wilson hurried to Sarah's side. She had begun to sway slightly, the effort of speaking having taken a tremendous toll on her damaged throat. Morgan reached her just as her knees buckled, catching her before she could fall. "Easy," he murmured, supporting her weight. "I've got you. You're safe now." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bright with exhaustion and relief. She tried to speak again, but Morgan gently pressed a finger to her lips. "Rest your voice," he said softly. "You've said enough for now. More than enough." As Jenkins led the prisoners away, with Harper keeping a watchful eye on them, Wilson examined Sarah's throat. "Remarkable," the doctor murmured. "The damage is extensive, yet she's managed to force sound through. With proper treatment, she might regain more function over time." "Can you help her?" Morgan asked. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "There are specialists in St. Louis who have made advances in treating such injuries. Surgical techniques that might improve her condition significantly." Sarah shook her head, touching her throat, and then gesturing to indicate it wasn't important. "It is important," Morgan insisted. "Your voice was taken from you by force. If there's a chance to reclaim even part of it, don't you want to try?" She studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Good," Wilson said briskly. "I'll write to Dr. Harmon immediately. He's the foremost expert in reconstructive surgery of the larynx. But first, we need to get you somewhere you can rest. You've been through quite an ordeal." As they helped Sarah from the ruined chapel, Morgan found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter in a storm to a confrontation in an abandoned mission, their paths had intertwined in ways he could never have anticipated. The future remained uncertain. Caldwell and Garrett would face charges, but the legal process was unpredictable. Sarah's recovery would take time, both physical and emotional. And Morgan himself had yet to fully reckon with the changes she had wrought in his carefully isolated life. But for now, it was enough that she was safe. that the truth had been spoken, that a voice silenced by cruelty had found its way back into the world, however painfully. As they emerged from the chapel into the bright Texas morning, Sarah paused, lifting her face to the sun. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the stillness. Without taking her eyes from the sky, Sarah reached for Morgan's hand, her fingers intertwining with his, in a grip that spoke of trust, hard-won and deeply valued. In that moment, Morgan understood what Sarah had been trying to tell him all along. Some bonds transcended words. Some connections needed no voice to be heard. And sometimes, the most profound songs were those sung in silence. 5 years later, the clinic on the outskirts of Hopewell Junction was busy, as it usually was on Wednesday mornings. Local ranchers, townspeople, and travelers from as far as San Antonio filled the waiting room, drawn by the reputation of the unusual partnership that operated there. Morgan Reeves moved efficiently from patient to patient, his manner professional but kind, his hands steady and sure, as they had been during his Army days. The years had added a few streaks of silver to his dark hair, but otherwise left him little changed, perhaps a bit less solemn, a bit more inclined to smile. In the adjoining room, Sarah Reeves worked with a young boy who had fallen from a horse, her gentle hands assessing the damage to his shoulder. The surgeries in St. Louis had partially restored her voice, a soft, slightly husky contralto that she used sparingly, still preferring the language of touch and gesture she had developed during her years of silence. "It's not broken," she told the anxious mother who hovered nearby. "Just badly bruised. He'll need to rest it for a week, then begin gentle exercises." She demonstrated the movements, the boy watching with solemn attention. "Like this every morning and evening. Can you do that for me, Daniel?" The boy nodded clearly, more captivated by Sarah than by the prospect of recovery exercises. It was a common reaction. There was something about her presence that drew people, especially children and animals. The clinic always seemed to have a stray dog or cat in residence, and a pair of rehabilitated hawks nested in the oak tree outside. As the morning patients dwindled, Morgan joined Sarah in her treatment room, watching as she finished wrapping the boy's shoulder in a supporting bandage. "You're getting better with the bindings," he observed when mother and child had departed. "That's a complicated one." Sarah smiled, a full, unguarded expression that still had the power to catch Morgan's breath. "I had a good teacher," she replied, her voice warm with affection. Morgan touched her cheek gently, his wedding ring catching the sunlight from the window. "How are you feeling today?" "Not too tired." "I'm fine," she assured him, though she did sit down, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen. 5 months along their first child was already making its presence known in subtle ways. Sarah's increased sensitivity to emotions, her deeper connection to the natural world around them. Morgan knelt beside her chair, placing his hand over hers. "She's active today," he said, feeling the flutter of movement beneath his palm. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You sound very certain." "Just a feeling," Morgan admitted, "though I'll be equally happy with a son." "Either way, this child will be loved," Sarah said softly, "and free to be exactly who they are meant to be." Morgan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. They had discussed this often, their determination that their child would never know the fear and suppression that had marked Sarah's early life, would never have to hide gifts or talents out of fear of being labeled unnatural or worse. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Elijah Harper stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway, a basket in his hands. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said, his deep voice warm with affection. "Brought some of those herbs you asked for, Sarah. Feverfew's coming in strong this year." "Thank you, Elijah." Sarah rose to accept the basket, inhaling the fragrant mixture appreciatively. Just in time, too. We're nearly out of the tincture. Harper had become a fixture at the clinic, officially serving as security, but in practice, contributing his extensive knowledge of herbal medicine tracking and survival skills. The unlikely friendship between the former slave and the former Confederate surgeon had raised eyebrows initially, but Hopewell Junction had grown accustomed to the unconventional arrangements at what locals now simply called the healing place. "And any word from Virginia?" Harper asked, his casual tone belied by the watchfulness in his eyes. Morgan shook his head. "Nothing since the letter last month. Caldwell is still serving his sentence. Garrett was released last year but headed west, according to our sources. No indication either of them has any interest in Texas anymore." The trial had been a sensation throughout the state, a respected minister convicted of attempted murder. His daughter testifying against him in a damaged but determined voice that no one who heard it ever forgot. Reverend Caldwell had been sentenced to 10 years in prison, his religious standing offering no protection against the weight of evidence and Sarah's compelling testimony. "Good," Harper said firmly, "though I still keep an eye out. Men like that, they can nurse a grudge for decades." "We're not afraid," Sarah said simply. "Not anymore." And it was true, Morgan realized. The fear that had shadowed them during those early days had faded, replaced by a cautious optimism, a willingness to build something lasting in spite of the darkness in their past. The clinic was part of that building, a place where conventional medicine and Sarah's more intuitive healing could complement each other, where those who needed help could find it without judgment or fear. Dr. Wilson had been their staunchest supporter, and even Mayor Thompson, humbled by his brother's censure after the false commitment papers came to light, had eventually acknowledged the value of their work. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, not the isolated Lone Star Ranch which they had sold, but a comfortable house near enough to town for the clinic, yet private enough for peace. Sarah took Morgan's hand and placed it again on her abdomen. "She's dreaming," Sarah said softly, using the female pronoun Morgan had chosen, though neither of them truly knew the child's gender. "I can feel it. She dreams of running through tall grass, of sunlight, of voices singing." Morgan marveled, as he often did, at the depth of Sarah's connection to the growing life within her. "Happy dreams," he murmured. "Yes." Sarah's smile was serene in the gathering dusk. "She knows she is wanted, knows she is safe." Morgan drew Sarah closer, his arm around her shoulders, as they watched the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the Texas sky. Scout, old now, but still devoted, lay at their feet, his rheumy eyes half-closed in contentment. In the distance, a coyote called its lonely song, rising to meet the stars. After a moment, another answered, then another, their voices blending in wild harmony. "They're singing to the Chinook," Sarah whispered, her expression one of wonder, even after all these years of communion with the natural world. Welcoming her. Morgan didn't question it. He had long since learned to accept that there were more ways of knowing, of hearing, of speaking than he had ever imagined in his earlier life. Sarah had taught him that, had shown him how to listen not just with his ears, but with his heart, had given him back a capacity for wonder he had thought lost forever in the blood and pain of Gettysburg. "I love you," he said, simply, the words as true now as they had been on the day he first spoke them, standing in the ruins of the mission chapel after Caldwell and Garrett had been taken away. "Both of you." Sarah turned to him, her eyes reflecting the emerging stars. "And we love you," she replied, her voice soft but clear, no longer constrained by old wounds or old fears. "Always." As night fell fully around them, they sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the coyote's song, to the whisper of the wind in the oak trees, to the steady rhythm of their own heartbeats. A family forged in fire, tempered by trials stronger for the breaking and mending they had each undergone. And somewhere in the darkness, a lone hawk called its cry, piercing and free, a perfect counterpoint to the song that continued to play between them, sometimes in silence, sometimes in whispers, but always, always heard.